My mother was terrified of snakes. And I don't think she's alone in that. I won't say I'm very scared of them, but I'm pretty scared of them. But there's a deeper reason beyond snakes sounding, feeling, and looking scary, right? And it's beyond the illness and death it can bring some of us. I remember we used to watch Discovery Channel and Animal Planet together, and whenever she saw some weird shit on TV, she would shriek and contort her face and say, "Look at that, look at that. Doesn't that scare you?" To which I'd be like, "No, they're inside the TV. Why? Why would I be scared?" Right? I didn't get why she was so freaked out. I just chalked it up as I think it's called ophidiophobia, whatever the fear of snakes is. And I never really knew why until I was an adult. And I think I mentioned in chapter 2 how my mother was raised on a farm in rural Louisiana, and how her father, the head of the house, was a mercurial, dominating, ultra alpha male. Well, my mother and her oldest sister used to partner up and pick crops together on their property, right? Outside the obvious unpleasantness of picking crops and everything else that goes along with that, my mother hated doing it because she said there were snakes in the field and they're hunting for field mice, gophers, and other rodents. All right, I get it. So my mother would beg her father to not send her out to the fields in exchange for some other chore. And when my grandfather would ask why, she would say, like, "Daddy, they got snakes in them fields and I'm scared of them." So, but that wasn't working. And my other aunt, her sister, the one she picked crops with, would chime in too and back my mother up like, "Yeah, Daddy, there's snakes out there and we're afraid." But what I'm told is my grandfather would reply and just be like, "Oh, girl, ain't that many snakes out there. Get on out there, get on back out there and get them damn crops." Like, all right. So now, in case you haven't read the book, or, you've forgotten some details, like saying no to my grandparents on my mother's side was not on the menu. My aunts and uncles did what they said, or, they got beaten. They got beaten with a whip, or that gun came out sometime, on top of being tasked with some other back-breaking chore. So what did my mother do? Well, she and my aunt went out into the field, and they decided they had to do something to let their father know that being out in them fields with those snakes was nerve-wracking. So one day, while they're out there working, my grandfather hops on his horse and he's making his rounds around the farm. He goes out into the field to check on how things were going with my uncles, tending to the hogs and chickens or whatever, and other animals in one part. And before making his way over to seeing my aunt and my mother, how they were doing picking the crops, right? So as the story goes, as I'm told, he arrives, eyeballs the job my mother and my aunt were doing. And before leaving, my mother asks, like, "Hey, Daddy, like, where are you going? Where are you going? Like, have a seat. Come talk to us for a little bit." So as the story goes, my grandfather says, "All right." And he gets off his horse, ties his horse to something. And so now he's just kind of standing around and chatting with him. So my mother then says, "Why don't you take a load off, Daddy? Why don't you have a seat right over there?" She says, pointing at some big tree stump where some big, I think like some walnut tree or something used to be. And my grandfather's like, "That ain't a bad idea. I'm going to do that." So he walks over to this big tree stump and he kind of raises his pants leg up. And just as he's about to squat and sit down, he like screams at the top of his lungs. He's like, "Oh shit, God damn it." He's like, "What the hell is that?" And he's saying this while he's pointing at the tree stump. The reason he's freaked out by the tree, and it wasn't the tree stump itself. He nearly jumped out of his skin because of what he saw on top of the tree stump, which was a pile of about 20 small to medium-sized snakes that my mother and my aunt had killed, I guess, earlier that morning. And so my mother says, "That's what we've been trying to tell you, Daddy. This these snakes that we killed is just from a few hours, and this is what we do every time you send us out here to work, my mother explained. So now my grandfather's kind of feeling like an asshole. And because there's nothing like having the receipts, as they say these days, right? And so he like thought about it, and he's like, you mean to tell me y'all killed all these snakes like this morning? And my mother's like, yes. And, my aunt is co-signing with her, like, yeah, we killed all of those and we ain't even done. So my grandfather had to eat a bit of crow. He thought they were just bullshitting and trying to get out of work, as teenagers sometimes try to do. I've done it. My siblings done it too. So why do I share this story? And why did I leave it out of the book? Well, I didn't really see where that anecdote would fit with the story I was telling, but I did recognize the value and the implications with respect to different forms of trauma. And my grandfather, he was described as this very intimidating, heavy-handed guy when it came to discipline. He used belts, he used whips, and like I said, he'll bring that pistol out he had. And I even share a story in chapter 1 or chapter 2 that how he beat my mother when she refused to marry this military guy that actually raped her. But they somehow thought this dude was like a good man for my mother. So outside of leaving the house and living on her own, something she would later do, there was no telling my grandfather, no, I'm not going to do this or I'm not going to do that. Like, there was serious consequences for everybody. And it wasn't until they actually showed him this big fucking Costco-sized pile of snakes that he didn't make them do that chore anymore. But the actual trauma of the snakes and the threat of my grandfather regulating stuck with my mother to her dying day. In fact, right before she went on hospice care, she was on heavy doses of morphine, and she started hallucinating one evening at the hospital. And again, she like would shriek and cower when my brother and I were trying to help her to the bathroom at the hospital. So what was it that was frightening her? Snakes. She thought she saw a bunch of snakes crawling around on the hospital floor. And, it really broke my heart that she was still feeling that level of fear with on top of dealing with cancer, this terminal illness that she had that was overcoming her. Excuse me. And this really like rose up to my motivation for writing a book and launching the Envia Foundation, my nonprofit dedicated for victims of violence. And I think you never really know what the lasting effects of violence are for people who are on the receiving end of it. And that is why I'm such a staunch critic on anybody outside of competitive, like combat sports that casually talk about harming others, man. Like lots of people, are like traumatized by violence. And I know tough people who are traumatized. I know former gangsters, military vets, women, children, you name it. So like, I think before we trivialize one's past and the things that happened to them, let's keep that in mind. It doesn't have to actually be a violent moment itself per se. The threat of violence and adjacent traumas, like in my mother's case, her deep fear of snakes can impact us, especially when they're not addressed. And when I think about something more relevant, like a lot of the talk in the political sphere and like what happened on January 6th, it's like, do you have any idea of what the implications are of what you're doing? Those officers, the Capitol Police defending politicians, those thousands of people that were storming the Capitol. And the whole time I'm thinking, how mindful are you of knowing how you can impact somebody's life emotionally, long-term, physically, long-term? People died at the Capitol. So I won't, I don't want to continue to rant, but Whether you're on the receiving end of violence, whether you're on the giving end of the violence, you have to make good and damn sure that it's in the name, the true, authentic name of self-defense or just necessary, because you can't take that stuff back, man. And fuck, if we can't be good to each other, if we can't be mindful and better human beings, who are we? Who are we?